My name is Kara Merritt, and I was 12 years old the summer my grandfather pressed a small, dented tin box into my hands and told me it was the most important thing he'd ever give me. "Don't lose this, sweetheart," Grandpa Ezra said, his voice rough like gravel dragged across a wooden floor. He smelled like pine sap and coffee, the way he always did after spending mornings on the back porch of his farmhouse in rural Vermont. His hands, big, scarred, weathered from decades of working the land, wrapped around mine like two warm oven mitts. "And whatever you do, don't let anybody tell you it's worthless." I remember looking down at that tin. It was old, really old, the kind of old that has a smell to it, a dusty, metallic, time-worn smell that tickled the back of your nose. The lid had a painting of a bluebird on it, faded almost to nothing. The latch was a little stiff, and when I opened it, I saw a folded piece of paper, a small brass key, and what looked like a bunch of old stock certificates, the fancy kind with scrollwork borders and official stamps that reminded me of something from a movie about the 1800s. "What is all this, Grandpa?" I asked. He smiled, and that smile had a sadness tucked inside it, the kind you only recognize years later when you're old enough to understand what loss looks like wearing a grin. "A piece of history," he said, "and maybe a little more than that, but you'll need to be patient to find out." 3 weeks later, Grandpa Ezra was gone. A heart attack. Fast, the doctor said, which was supposed to be comforting, but never really felt that way. And so began the worst year of my life, and eventually the most important. My mother, Diane Merritt, was a woman who measured the value of things almost entirely by their appearance. I say this not to be cruel, because I loved my mother, and love sometimes means being honest about the parts of a person that cause damage. She was beautiful in the way that made people give her the benefit of the doubt too often. Tall, polished, with dark auburn hair she kept in a perfect chignon even on Saturdays. She wore silk blouses to grocery stores and dismissed anything, objects, people, ideas, that didn't meet her particular standard of presentable. She had married my father, Gerald Merritt, when they were both 24. Gerald was a quiet, steady man who worked as a civil engineer, kept his head down, and expressed love through acts of service rather than words. He fixed things when they broke, mowed the lawn without being asked, and made pancakes every Sunday morning without fail. He adored Diane, and Diane accepted his adoration the way a cat accepts warmth, comfortably, and with the unspoken assumption that it would always be there. Grandpa Ezra was Gerald's father, and Diane had never much cared for him. "He's a nice enough man," she used to say, which was the damning with faint praise version of admitting she found him irrelevant. Ezra was old-fashioned in his clothes, his speech, his values. He drove a 1987 pickup truck. He grew his own vegetables. He didn't have a smartphone until my dad bought him one as a joke gift, and even then he only used it to check weather. To Diane, he represented everything she had worked to move away from: rural, plain, unimpressive. So when Grandpa Ezra died and left the tin box to me and nothing to anyone else, Diane's reaction was predictable. "What on earth did he give you?" she asked, the evening of the funeral. We were back at our house in Concord, New Hampshire, a nice colonial on a tree-lined street that my mother had worked very hard to furnish in a way that said "successful family" without screaming it. She was still in her funeral dress, wine glass in hand, while my dad sat at the kitchen table staring at nothing. I showed her the tin. She opened it, poked at the stock certificates with 2 fingers, the way you might examine something that washed up on a beach, and then she looked at me with an expression caught halfway between pity and irritation. "Kara, sweetheart, these are old certificates. These companies probably don't even exist anymore." She turned one over, squinted at it. "Atlas Consolidated Railway, there's no such company now. These are decorative at best." "Grandpa said not to let anyone tell me they were worthless," I said. Something shifted in her expression. It was brief, a flicker of something I didn't have a name for at 12, but would later identify as a very specific kind of adult pride that doesn't like being corrected by the memory of someone it already dismissed. "Your grandfather was a sweet man," she said carefully, "but he was not a financial expert, Kara. He was a farmer who kept odd things. He probably found these in an antique store and thought they were neat." She set the tin on the counter. My dad, Gerald, didn't look up. He was somewhere far away that evening, grieving in the silent, thorough way that strong men grieve, and I didn't want to add to his pain, so I didn't push further. I took the tin box upstairs to my bedroom, put it on the shelf above my desk, and went to sleep thinking about Grandpa Ezra's hands wrapped around mine. There was one other person in our family orbit who mattered in this story, and her name was Renata Voss. Renata was my mother's younger sister, 10 years younger, which meant she was only 28 when all this happened. She was staying with us for 3 months that summer while her apartment in Boston was being renovated, and she occupied our guest room with an energy that was both electric and exhausting. Renata was everything my mother was not, at least on the surface. Loud, expressive, given to wearing paint-stained overalls and making her own earrings. She was an art buyer for a small gallery in the South End, and she had a sharp, practiced eye for things that other people overlooked. She could walk into a flea market and spot the one item with real value in 30 seconds flat. I liked Renata. She talked to me like a person, not a child. She asked me questions about what I was reading and actually waited for the answer. She brought me a book about unsolved historical mysteries for my birthday and then wanted to discuss it chapter by chapter. She had curly, dark hair that she kept in a messy bun, and she laughed with her whole body, which was the kind of laugh that made you want to be funny just to see it again. But Renata also had a complicated relationship with my mother, a competitive one, the kind forged in childhood and never quite resolved, where every achievement of one felt like a subtle comment on the other. Renata had never married, which Diane considered a quiet failure. Diane had never pursued her own career with passion, which Renata considered a quiet surrender. They loved each other the way some sisters do, fiercely and grudgingly, with a continuous low hum of friction underneath. When Renata saw the tin box on my shelf, she stopped in the doorway of my bedroom. "What's that?" she asked. "Grandpa Ezra's gift," I said. "Mom thinks the certificates are worthless." Renata walked over slowly, the way she moved when something had caught her professional attention. She picked up one of the certificates, turned it over, examined the back with narrowed eyes, then she picked up another, and another. She said. "What?" She set them down carefully. "I'm not sure yet. Some of these old certificates, sometimes they're worth collecting just for the historical value, sometimes more." She glanced at me. "You should look into this, Kara, seriously." I nodded, not quite understanding the weight of what she was saying. The next morning, the tin box was gone from my shelf. I searched my room first, methodically, the way you do when you're 12 and still believe lost things turn up if you look hard enough. Under the bed, behind the desk, inside the closet, in the drawer where I kept things that mattered. It wasn't there. I went downstairs. My mother was in the kitchen making her morning coffee, already dressed, already composed, already armored for the day. "Mom," I said, "did you move the tin box from my room?" She didn't look up from the coffee maker. "Oh, that." A small pause, the kind of pause that has a decision inside it. "I cleaned up a bit this morning. That box went in the recycling. Those papers, too, they were cluttering your desk." The floor dropped out from under me. "You threw it away?" My voice came out wrong, smaller than I intended. "Kara," she turned to look at me then, patient but firm, the way she delivered all decisions she'd already made. "It was junk, sweetheart, old paper. I know Grandpa meant well, but holding on to sentimental clutter doesn't help you." "It was mine," my voice cracked. "Grandpa gave it to me. He held my hands and told me to keep it. He said, whatever you do, don't let anybody tell you it's worthless." Something moved across her face. It was gone quickly. I understand you're grieving, and I'm sorry, but I was already running out the back door to the recycling bins. They had already been picked up. It was Tuesday, recycling day. I stood in the driveway in my bare feet, staring at the empty blue bin, and I understood for the first time in my life what it felt like to lose something irretrievably. Not just the object, the tin box, the certificates, the brass key, but the last tangible piece of Grandpa Ezra, the thing he had pressed into my hands while his eyes still had light in them, the thing he had trusted me with. I sat down on the driveway and cried. Not the dignified kind of crying, the loud, ugly kind, with snot and gasping and no self-consciousness whatsoever, because I was 12 and I didn't care. My dad found me there 20 minutes later, coming out to get the newspaper. He said nothing. He just sat down next to me on the driveway in his work clothes and put his arm around me. And we sat there together for a long time. He never said anything to Diane about it, at least not that I heard. Renata heard about it that evening when she came home from the gallery. I watched her face as I told her the story, and I saw something sharpen in her expression, a particular kind of anger that quietly goes cold instead of hot.
"She threw away all of it?" Renata said carefully. "The certificates, the key, everything?" "Everything," I said. Renata sat very still for a moment. Then she said, "Did you at least see the names on the certificates before they were gone? Do you remember any of them?" I thought hard. Atlas Consolidated Railway. There were a few others. One said Harmon and Sons something, and there was one with an eagle on it. Renata nodded slowly. She was pressing her lips together in the way she did when she was working something out. "Kara," she said, "I want you to do something for me. I want you to look up something called Old Stock Certificates Value tonight. Just read some things, okay?" I did, and what I found made my stomach turn over in the strangest way. Part grief, part growing suspicion, part something that felt, at 12, like the first real stirring of injustice. Old stock certificates, I learned, were sometimes worth nothing, but sometimes they were worth enormous amounts of money, either because the companies had merged into larger entities that still owed dividends to original holders, or because the certificates themselves were valuable to collectors. There were entire companies dedicated to researching this, called Scripple-Philly firms, and some people had discovered that their grandparents' worthless papers were worth tens of thousands of dollars. I went to bed that night with a new feeling sitting in my chest. Not quite rage, I was too young and too sad for rage. More like a slow, cold awareness that something important had been lost, and that maybe, just maybe, it hadn't been an accident of ignorance. Here is where the story takes a turn that I didn't expect. 3 months after the recycling incident, we went to Grandpa Ezra's farmhouse to help clear it out. Dad was executor of the estate, which wasn't a complicated job because Ezra had lived simply and owned straightforwardly the farmhouse, the land, a few $1,000s in a checking account, and the belongings of a man who repaired things instead of replacing them. The farmhouse was being sold. Dad had made this decision quietly and without much discussion, and I understood even at 12 that it was because he couldn't afford to keep it and couldn't bear to visit it. Some griefs are too large to be practical about. I spent the day exploring every room one last time, touching things, memorizing. The kitchen with its hanging copper pots, the living room with its stone fireplace and the bookshelf crammed with field guides and old paperbacks. The back porch where Grandpa Ezra had drunk his morning coffee and watched the valley wake up. In Grandpa Ezra's bedroom, in the top drawer of his dresser, I found something. It was a letter, sealed with my name written on the front in Grandpa Ezra's careful, looping handwriting. Kara, for when you're ready. My hands were shaking when I opened it. The letter was 3 pages long, written on yellow legal pad paper in Ezra's cramped, deliberate script. I won't reproduce all of it, but here is what mattered. He had bought those stock certificates in 1971 from a man going out of business. He had paid very little for them at the time because most people considered them of minimal worth.
One of them, the Atlas Consolidated Railway certificate, he had reason to believe was significant. He had done some research in his final years, using the computer his son had set up for him, and the help of a woman at the library he describes only as a very sharp young lady with red-framed glasses. Atlas Consolidated Railway had been absorbed in the 1950s into a larger conglomerate, which itself merged twice more over the following decades. The final entity, through a chain of mergers and acquisitions that Grandpa Ezra had traced and described in the letter, was a company called Hargrove Capital Partners, which, as of the date he wrote the letter, was a mid-sized investment firm in Boston Bank with assets under management in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Original holders of Atlas shares, he wrote, had been carried through each merger. Under securities law, those original share stakes, if documented, potentially entitled the holders to claim their proportional value. It wasn't a fortune, he said carefully. He didn't want me to expect a fortune, but he believed the shares were worth somewhere between $40,000 and $80,000, maybe more with accrued dividends. The brass key opened a safe deposit box at a bank in Burlington, Vermont, First Granite Bank, box number 227. Inside that safe deposit box was additional documentation, the original purchase records for the certificates, his research, and copies he had made of each certificate just in case. I made copies, Kara. I knew you'd be growing up surrounded by people who throw away what they don't understand. I'm not saying this unkindly. I'm saying it because I wanted to protect you. The key is what matters. Keep the key. I sat on Grandpa Ezra's bedroom floor and read that letter 4 times. Then I looked at the envelope again and noticed something I'd missed initially. In the bottom left corner, in very small letters, Grandpa had written, P.S. Check the loose floorboard under my desk, left side. I went to his desk. I crouched down. I pressed on the floorboards until one shifted, and underneath it, nestled in a little cloth bag tied with twine, was a duplicate key. The original key was in the recycling bin, but Grandpa Ezra, who had lived through enough to know that life sometimes requires a backup plan, had left me a second one. I put the key in the pocket of my jeans. I folded the letter small and tucked it inside my jacket. I told no one. Not yet. I was 12 when I found that key. I was 18 when I finally used it. 6 years is a long time to carry something in silence. But here's the thing about being a girl with a secret. You don't have resources. You can't drive to Burlington. You can't open a safe deposit box into someone else's name. You can't navigate bank bureaucracy or estate law. You can barely navigate the school cafeteria. So I waited. I kept Grandpa Ezra's letter in a fireproof lockbox I bought with saved birthday money and kept under my bedroom floorboards. Yes, I know, I learned it from him, along with the spare key. I researched. I read about securities law, about safe deposit box inheritance protocols, about how to transfer financial claims after a person's death. I emailed a law clinic at a Vermont university when I was 15, using a fake name, asking hypothetical questions. I built a file. I also watched my family. The years were not kind to the cracks that already existed. My dad, Gerald, worked more and spoke less. The grief of losing Ezra had settled into him like a weight he'd adjusted his posture around. My mother, Diane, redecorated the living room twice, joined a tennis club, organized charity galas, and otherwise filled the space where depth might have been with the busyness of someone who was slightly afraid of quiet. They were not unhappy, exactly. They were the particular kind of married that looks fine from the outside and feels from the inside like 2 people orbiting the same address. Renata came and went. Her gallery did well, then better. She moved from the South End to a nicer place in Cambridge. She texted me links to articles about historical finance, old railroad stocks, art authentication. She never asked me directly what I was planning, but I think she knew. She had the patience that comes from working with art, the ability to let things reveal themselves in their own time. There was a moment in my junior year of high school that I need to tell you about. My mother and I were in the car, driving home from my college prep tutoring session. She was in a good mood. She'd just come from a lunch where someone had complimented her on organizing a fundraiser. The radio was on, a soft pop station she liked, and out of nowhere she said, "I've been thinking about your grandfather lately." I said nothing, kept my eyes on the road blur outside my window. "I know the way I handled that box was probably not ideal," she said. "You were upset. It was a hard time." A pause. "But honestly, Kara, those things really were just old paper. I think you were more attached to the sentiment than the reality." That's what she believed. I want you to understand that fully. She wasn't being deceptive in that moment. She genuinely thought she'd thrown away junk. She was offering what she considered a reasonable adult perspective. I turned to look at her profile, her steady, confident profile, and I thought about Grandpa Ezra's voice. "Don't let anybody tell you it's worthless." "You might be right," I said, and I tucked the key a little deeper into my heart. The summer I turned 18, 2 weeks before I was supposed to leave for college, I drove to Burlington. I had saved money from working at a hardware store all through high school. I had my driver's license, I had the key, the letter, my grandfather's death certificate, a copy I'd quietly requested from the state when I was 16, because I had learned by then to prepare, and documentation that I was the name's recipient in his personal letter. I also had Renato with me. I had told her 2 nights before, sitting in her Cambridge apartment while she made us tea. I laid it all out. The letter, the key, the 6 years of research, the plan. I watched her face as I talked. She didn't say anything for a long time when I finished. Then she said, "Kara, I owe you an apology." I looked at her, surprised. "When your mom threw away those certificates, I didn't push back hard enough. I was annoyed, yes. I thought she was probably being careless with something valuable, but I told myself it wasn't my business. It was a complicated family situation, and I let it go." She looked at me steadily. "That was wrong. You were 12. Someone should have advocated for you more forcefully. I should have." I thought about that. "You told me to look it up. You took it seriously." "That's not the same as protecting you," she said. "I'm sorry." It was the most valuable apology I'd ever received because it was specific and clean, with no deflection in it. "Come with me to Burlington. I think I might need a grown-up." She laughed. "You're 18. "I know, but I've been doing this alone for 6 years. I don't want to do the last part alone." She came. First Granite Bank was a modest, serious-looking institution on a tree-lined street in Burlington's Old North End, the kind of bank that had been there long enough to have marble countertops and wooden teller partitions and the faint institutional smell of stale air and important transactions. The sort of bank my grandfather would have trusted precisely because it wasn't trying to impress you. The teller, a man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and the careful politeness of someone who has delivered a great deal of both good and bad news, reviewed my documentation with unhurried thoroughness. He went to get the branch manager. The branch manager, a woman named Patricia Osei, early 40s, natural hair, a navy blazer with a small American flag pin, came out and introduced herself and reviewed the paperwork again. "Miss Merritt," she said, "your grandfather specified you as the beneficiary of this box in his estate instructions. You have the key, the death certificate, and the original letter establishing your relationship." She looked at me over her reading glasses. "This is all in order. You're welcome to open the box." She led us to the safe deposit room in the back of the bank. Renata squeezed my hand once. I put the key in the lock. Box 227 contained a large envelope, a smaller envelope, and a handwritten index card on which Grandpa Ezra had written, in his careful, looping script, "Everything you need. Now go find someone smart to help you. E.M." The large envelope held copies, clean, beautifully preserved photocopies of every stock certificate, clearly labeled. A handwritten chain of corporate succession for Atlas Consolidated Railway, with dates and sources cited. Printouts from a state securities database. Notes from what appeared to be a telephone conversation Ezra had with someone at the Vermont State Securities Division. The smaller envelope held something I hadn't expected. 3 more documents. original documents, not copies. 2 were additional stock certificates, not from Atlas Railway, but from a smaller company called Harmon Agricultural Holdings, which Grandpa Ezra's notes indicated had been acquired by a regional investment bank in 1988. And the 3rd was a savings bond, a Series EE savings bond purchased in 1986 for $500, made out to Kara Jean Merritt. My grandfather had been saving for me before I was born. He had known my father was going to have children, and he had started preparing. The bond had been accruing interest for over 30 years. I sat in the little private booth in the safe deposit room with copies and originals spread across the table, and I cried for the second time in my life in the big, embarrassing way. Renata put her arm around me and didn't say anything, which was exactly right. After I had pulled myself together, Patricia Osei referred us to a colleague, a securities attorney named Desmond Fairweather, who worked with estate claims and had apparently helped several clients with exactly this kind of historical stock research. She gave us her card with the professional assurance of someone who had witnessed this kind of reunion before. Desmond Fairweather was not what I expected. He was 35, slight, with a precisely trimmed beard, and the habit of making extremely rapid notes on a yellow legal pad while you talked, barely looking up. His office in Burlington was small and slightly chaotic, with stacks of folders and old financial documents everywhere, and a single framed print of the cover of a 1930s business magazine on the wall. He wore cardigans. He had 3 empty coffee mugs on his desk and seemed unaware of them. He listened to my full story without interruption, reading each document as I handed it over, making his rapid notes. When he finished, he looked up for the first time. "Okay," he said. 2 things immediately. The Series EE bond is straightforward. It's yours, it's valid. With 32 years of accrued interest at the applicable federal rates, it's worth somewhere in the range of $2,000 to $3,000. Simple redemption. He set it aside. Now, the Atlas Consolidated Certificates. He leaned back. Your grandfather did solid research. The chain of succession he traced is accurate. I've actually worked on 2 similar cases involving Atlas Railway predecessor shares before. He paused, and something shifted in his expression. His estimate was conservative. I looked at him. Your certificates represented a larger stake than he realized, I think because he was only looking at the face value, not accounting for the stock splits and dividend reinvestments that occurred during the merger transitions. When I traced the full chain forward, he made a few quick calculations on his pad. The proportional claim against the successor entity, which is now technically a subsidiary of a Boston-based holding company, is, in my preliminary assessment, significant. How significant? Renata asked. Desmond Fairweather wrote a number on his legal pad and turned it to face us. I stared at it. Is that right? I said. Preliminary, he said again. Could be somewhat more, could be somewhat less, depending on dividend dispute resolution, but that's a realistic range. He set down his pen. Kara, this is the kind of claim that takes a few months to fully establish and process. There will be documentation requirements, some correspondence with the holding company's legal team. They don't love paying these claims, but they can't avoid them. You'll pay legal fees. But yes, that number is real. I sat very still for a moment. The number on that pad was in the range of $112,000. Outside Desmond Fairweather's office, standing on the sidewalk in the warm August afternoon, Renata and I didn't speak for almost a minute. Then she said, Kara. Yeah? Your mother threw away $100,000? Yeah. Because it looked like junk? Yeah. We stood there with the summer sun warm on our faces, and I thought about 12-year-old me sitting on the cold driveway in my bare feet, staring at an empty recycling bin. Then I thought about something else. Something that had been building in me for 6 years, slowly and quietly, like a tide you don't notice until the water is up to your waist. I thought about what I was going to do now. I want to be honest about the 6 weeks between hiring Desmond Fairweather and the day I sat down with my parents. I was not gracious about it immediately, let me be real with you, My first feeling was vindication, the pure, clean, almost physical satisfaction of having been right, of having held on, quietly, for 6 years against a world that had told me to let go and move on and trust the adults. That feeling was real, and I'm not going to pretend it wasn't. My second feeling was something darker. I spent a few nights imagining how I would tell my mother, the look on her face, the way her certainty would crumble. I could see it exactly, the moment she understood what she'd thrown away, what she'd dismissed, what she'd casually discarded because it didn't fit her understanding of value. I wanted to be there for that moment. I wanted to see it. I'm not proud of that, but I think it's important to be honest about it, because the difference between what I wanted to do and what I actually did is the whole point of this story. Renata called me one evening while I was in the middle of this particular cycle. "How are you doing?" she asked. "I'm thinking about how to tell her," I said. "How to tell her or how to show her?" A long pause. "Both." "Okay," Renata said, and she was quiet for a moment. "Can I tell you something about your mother that might not be comfortable to hear?" "Sure." She wasn't malicious, Kara. She threw away something valuable because she genuinely didn't know what it was, and because she has never learned to sit with uncertainty, to hold something she doesn't understand and wait rather than categorize and dismiss. That's a flaw, a real one, and one that cost you something real. Renata paused. But the version of revenge where you walk in with a banker and watch her face fall, that's not going to feel the way you think it will. I've seen people do that kind of thing. The satisfaction is real for about 30 seconds, and then it's hollow, and then you're just a person who chose cruelty when they could have chosen clarity. I didn't say anything. "Your grandfather knew this about your mother," Renata said gently. "That's why he made copies. That's why he left you a second key. He wasn't naive about who she was. He just refused to let who she was determine what you received. Does that make sense?" It made sense. "What would you do?" I asked. "I'd tell her the truth," Renata said. "Simply, without theater. Let the truth be heavy enough on its own. It always is." I thought about that for a long time. The phone call from First Granite Bank came in early September. I had already started college, a small liberal arts school in New Hampshire that I'd chosen partly for its strong business and finance program and partly because it wasn't far from home. I was back for a long weekend when it happened. I was sitting at the kitchen table eating cereal when my dad's phone rang, and he answered it in the other room, and then his voice changed. I heard him say, "Can you repeat that?" And then, after a pause, "I see. Yes, of course. Can you give me a time tomorrow?" He came back into the kitchen with a strange expression. That was someone from First Granite Bank in Burlington. They said they need to speak to a Kara Merritt about a safe deposit box claim. He looked at me. "Do you know what that's about?" My mother was in the living room, visible through the archway. She looked up from her book. This was the moment I'd spent 6 weeks thinking about. "Yes," I said. "I do. Can we sit down together, all 3 of us?" They looked at each other, and then they sat at the table with me. I told them everything, all of it. The tin box, Grandpa Ezra's words, finding the letter in the farmhouse, the spare key under the floorboard, the 6 years of research, the drive to Burlington with Renata, Desmond Fairweather, the number on the legal pad. I kept my voice even. I didn't perform it. I didn't pause for effect. I just told them the truth. My father's face went through several things while I talked. Grief first, the old kind for his father, then something like wonder, then a quiet, certain pride that he tried not to show but couldn't quite hide. My mother sat very still. When I finished, there was a long silence. "How much?" my mother said finally. "Somewhere around $112,000, maybe more. Desmond, the attorney, is still finalizing the claim." Diane Merritt sat at that kitchen table and experienced something I had never seen her experience before. She went pale. Not embarrassed pale, The kind of pale that comes when your understanding of something shifts all at once, like a building settling in an earthquake. The color drained from her face, slowly, over several seconds, and she sat with her hands flat on the table, and she didn't say anything for a very long time. "The certificates," she said at last. "The ones He had made copies," I said. "Grandpa Ezra made copies and put them in the safe deposit box because he knew things didn't always stay where they were put." She closed her eyes. My father reached across the table and put his hand over mine, and he kept it there. "Kara," my mother said, and her voice had something in it I almost didn't recognize. "I am so sorry." The thing about those words is that I had rehearsed my response to them. I had imagined what I would say when she apologized. I had whole speeches prepared, some of them kind, some of them sharper. I had anticipated this moment for years. But sitting there in that kitchen with my dad's hand on mine and my mother's face stripped of its usual armor, I found that the speeches didn't fit. What I felt was not triumph. It was not forgiveness yet either. That would take longer. What I felt was something much simpler. I felt sad. For her, mostly. For the years she had spent measuring value by surface and missing what was underneath. For the certainty she had carried that had cost her, and me, something real. For all the things she might have thrown away over the years because they didn't look impressive enough to deserve careful attention. "I know," I said. "I know you didn't mean for it to happen that way." She opened her eyes. They were bright with something. "But I want you to understand," I said, "that what hurt wasn't the money. I didn't know about the money when I was 12. What hurt was that it was Grandpa's. It was the last thing he gave me, and it felt like you didn't think that mattered enough to handle carefully." The silence after that was the kind that changes rooms. 2 weeks later, I was called into the office of Mr. Henry Alcott, the regional manager for First Granite Bank, to finalize some aspects of the estate claim documentation. He was a large, calm man in a brown suit who had clearly spent decades facilitating important moments in people's lives and had developed a deliberate, unhurried quality to his movements as a result. He shook my hand. He offered me coffee, which I accepted, and gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Miss Merritt," he said, and he picked up a folder from his desk and held it for a moment without opening it. "I want to tell you something before we go through the paperwork." I waited. "I've been in this business for 31 years, he said. "I've seen a great many safe deposit boxes opened, a great many estates settled, a great many claims filed." He paused. "And I've learned to recognize when someone comes in to collect on a claim like yours, whether what they're primarily after is the money or something else." I looked at him. "Your grandfather opened that box in 1989. He came in once a year, every year, to update the documents inside. Our records show his last visit was 8 months before he passed. He added the copies of the certificates on that last visit. He opened the folder then. There was also a note added on that last visit that I think belongs to you." He pushed a single piece of paper across the desk. It was a half-page note in Grandpa Ezra's handwriting, dated 8 months before his death. "To whoever helps my granddaughter find this, thank you. To Kara, if you're reading this, you kept the faith. That's worth more than what's in this box. But I hope what's in this box helps you build something good. Don't waste it on anger. Spend it on your future and on the people who deserve it. I love you, kid. I always have. Grandpa E." I sat in Henry Alcott's brown-suited office and held that piece of paper, and I understood fully and finally what Grandpa Ezra actually gave me. It was not $112,000, though that was real and it mattered. It was the understanding that patience is a form of love, that preparation is a form of trust, that choosing to protect someone's future quietly and without expectation of witness is the deepest kind of generosity there is, and that what you do with a windfall and what you do with an injustice says more about you than either the windfall or the injustice ever could. The claim was settled 4 months later. The final amount, after Desmond Fairweather's fees and the various processing costs, was $108,347. I want to tell you what I did with it because the doing matters. $30,000 went into a college fund. Mine, technically, but I redirected most of it toward a scholarship account I set up at my university for students from rural Vermont backgrounds, in Grandpa Ezra's name, the Ezra Merit Agricultural Scholarship. It's not a huge scholarship, but it exists and it carries his name, and every year it gives someone a chance he would have recognized. $25,000 I put in a long-term investment account, exactly like Grandpa would have approved of. Slowly, carefully, without drama.
$15,000 I gave to my father. Not to my parents, to my father specifically, because he was Ezra's son and because the loss of his father had been carried so long and so quietly. I told him to do whatever he wanted with it. He used half of it to buy a small piece of land in Vermont, near where Ezra's farmhouse had been, and he goes there sometimes in the summers. I think it helps him. And $5,000, this part surprised even me, I gave to Renata, not as repayment for anything, but as a gift. She had been the one adult in my 12-year-old world who had taken the tin box seriously, who had told me to look into it, who had sat with me in the bank and put her arm around me when I cried. She tried to refuse it. I told her Grandpa Ezra had specifically said to spend the money on people who deserved it. "Did he actually say that?" she asked. "Close enough," I said. She laughed with her whole body, the way she always did. As for my mother, this is the part I thought about the longest. I did not give my mother money. I want to be clear about that. Not because it was a punishment, but because it would have been the wrong gesture. The point was never financial. The point was something harder and more essential. What I did instead was ask her to have lunch with me, just the two of us, at a small restaurant in Concord that she liked, with linen napkins and good bread, the kind of place where she was comfortable enough to be honest. We sat across from each other, and I asked her to tell me about Grandpa Ezra. Not what she thought of him, I knew that. I asked her to tell me something she remembered about him that she actually liked. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "He came to our wedding, your parents' wedding. He wore this suit, an old suit, too big in the shoulders, clearly from decades earlier, and I remember thinking it looked ridiculous." She looked down at her water glass. "But when he danced with his son, when he and Gerald danced at the reception, just the two of them, some old song on the speakers, he looked like the most natural, dignified person in the room. I remember thinking, where did that come from?" She shook her head. "I didn't understand people like him very well. I still don't entirely. People who carry their worth on the inside rather than the outside." It was, I think, the most honest thing she had ever said to me. "That's what I needed to hear," I told her. She looked up. "Why?" "Because it means you saw him," I said. "Even if it was just that one moment, you saw who he was." She reached across the table and took my hand, not the confident maternal hand-holding of my childhood, but something more tentative and real. "I'm working on it," she said, not throwing things away before I understand them. "I'm trying." I believed her. Not completely. Some patterns are deep and old and only change slowly, but enough. I believed she was trying, and I decided that was enough to begin with. I'm 24 now, sitting at the desk in my apartment, writing this down because I think it needs to be written. A few things have settled in me over the years that I want to share. The first is about patience. Grandpa Ezra was a farmer. Farmers plant things in the fall and wait through the winter and trust the spring. They do not dig up seeds to check on them. They do not panic when the ground looks frozen and dead. They prepare, they plant, and they wait. What I held for 6 years was not a grudge, it was a seed. The difference is that a grudge is something you tend to keep you warm, and a seed is something you tend to become what it was always going to be. The second is about value. My mother was wrong about the certificates, but she wasn't wrong in the way I thought she was for a long time. She wasn't simply ignorant or careless.
She had developed over many years a genuine blindness to a certain kind of value, the quiet, undramatic, patient kind. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that requires sitting with uncertainty and trusting what you don't fully understand yet. That blindness is actually quite common. Most of us have some version of it. The practice of combating it is one of the most important practices there is. The third is about forgiveness. I have forgiven my mother, not because what she didn't matter, but because the alternative, carrying the weight of her mistake as a permanent wound, would require me to define myself by her failure for the rest of my life. Grandpa Ezra did not do that. He prepared for her failure, calmly and without bitterness, because he knew what she was like and loved his granddaughter more than he needed to be right. That is a very high form of love. The fourth is about what to do when you've been wronged. There is a version of this story where I walk into my family home with a bank statement and watch my mother's face collapse. And that version exists because I felt the pull of it. I want to be honest about that pull. It is real and it is human, and I don't think it makes anyone a bad person to feel it. But Grandpa Ezra's note said, "Don't waste it on anger. Spend it on your future and on the people who deserve it." Anger spent on making people feel small does not build anything. It uses up fuel that could have gone somewhere worth going. The last thing I want to say is this. Somewhere right now, there is someone sitting with something they've been told is worthless. It might be a talent their family never understood, a dream that doesn't look impressive enough, a relationship that other people dismiss, a belief that has no financial value but enormous personal truth. Hold on to it. Not with clenched fists and not with bitterness, but with the kind of patient, steady, unshakable faith that a 12-year-old girl carried in the pocket of her jeans for 6 years, all the way to a small bank in Burlington, Vermont, where a branch manager named Patricia Osei led her to safe deposit box number 227 and said, "This is all in order. You're welcome to open the box." Sometimes the most important thing anyone will ever tell you is, don't let anybody tell you it's worthless. Listen to the people who say that. They are the ones who understand something essential about this world, that value is not always visible, patience is not always passive, and the things that matter most are often the things that look, to the impatient eye, like nothing at all. The Ezra Merit Agricultural Scholarship has now been awarded to 7 students. Each letter of acceptance includes a single line that reads, "This scholarship was funded by a man who believed that what you hold quietly and carefully is worth far more than what you show off loudly. We hope you hold your education the same way."